Albany, New York, Memorial Day, 1996. A soldier named Henry Johnson is honored for bravery in World War I. He was part of a remarkable regiment of black Americans who fought longer and harder than any other Yanks in the war, despite brutal discrimination.
Any time that we were involved with Americans, no matter where it was at, we was always ostracized, always. Always pointed out or mistreated.
The discrimination ran so deep, these African Americans had to do all their fighting in the French army. Who were these men? Why did they have to serve under foreign command? And how did they earn the nickname, the Harlem Hellfighters?
The boys! Go to it! Hey! Get the bloody boys! Get them! Stick them! Get the bayonets on the ram it on! What do you hear? Nothing near. Don't fear. All clear. That's the life of a stroller when you take a patrol. Out in no man's land. Ain't it grand? Out in no man's land.
78 years after his act of heroism, Henry Johnson was honored. The triumphant story of Johnson and his fellow Harlem Hellfighters, the 369th Regiment, is unknown to most Americans, their exploits omitted from most history books. But it is remembered by men like 110-year-old Herbert Young.
So we fought like Trojans. Ain't nobody tell you no different.
Throughout history, black soldiers have had to fight simultaneously for their country and for equal status within that country. And after each of the battles, their achievements have been ignored or belittled. In the Civil War, there was resistance to using black soldiers in combat. As Union casualties mounted and blacks demanded a role, that changed.
And by the time the war ends, almost 185,000 African Americans are soldiers in the United States Army, and another 17,000 play a role in the U.S. Navy. One of the black troops that was created during the Civil War, a troop had as its banner, it said, "It is now our turn to prove our worth as men." And that notion of proving your worth was central to so much of what went on during the Civil War for black Americans.
After the Civil War, the government organized 4 black regular Army regiments, the 24th and 25th Infantry and the 9th and 10th Cavalry. Because of their bravery and their dark skins, the cavalry were called Buffalo Soldiers by the Indians. The 9th and 10th Cavalry played a crucial role in the Spanish-American War. This film, attributed to Thomas Edison, shows African-American cavalrymen disembarking during that war. Serving on foot, because their horses were left in Florida, the 9th and 10th repeatedly came to the aid of white units. Theodore Roosevelt, in command of the Rough Riders, was the most famous soldier to emerge from that war. At first, Roosevelt paid tribute to the black soldiers, but then turned his back on their contributions.
And even Teddy Roosevelt talked about how these colored soldiers played a major role. Now, it's interesting that Roosevelt says that immediately after the war. But as he enters into public life, he begins to distance himself from the black soldiers. And he begins to say that the soldiers were there, but they really weren't the most efficient soldiers. They weren't the bravest soldiers. That in a way, his Rough Riders carried the day independent of blacks.
One white Spanish-American War veteran who never wavered in his trust of black soldiers was Colonel William Haywood. In 1916, Haywood, an ardent civil rights advocate, began organizing the 15th Regiment, New York State's first all-black National Guard unit, here in Harlem. At first, recruiting was slow, but then Haywood persuaded James Reese Europe, the most popular black band leader of the time, to enlist as a lieutenant and form the regimental band. Europe's musical standards were much higher than the Army's. To accommodate him, Haywood stretched, bent, or broke every Army regulation governing a regimental band. The band was larger than regulation, contained instruments never envisioned by the Army, and was led by an officer instead of the regulation sergeant. Hayward even sent Europe to Puerto Rico to recruit woodwind players because the band leader believed that island had the best in the world.
He brought his band out in a little music, the Pied Piper theory, and he started getting his recruits. But that wasn't the hard part, that was the easy part. The hard part was now to get this regiment together, get an association, and get them somewhat trained into a military order. They didn't have any weapons, so they used broomsticks, and they used the backyards to dig trenches and make believe the type warfare that was going on over in Europe at the time, and they did the best they could.
Colonel Hayward tried to affiliate his regiment with the Rainbow Division, a unit being formed with regiments from several states.
He had recruited all blacks, and the division people at the time said, sorry, Colonel, but black is not a color of the rainbow.
Colonel Hayward could do nothing about the Army's strict segregation policies concerning enlisted men, but his officer corps was integrated from the beginning, with some white officers subordinate to higher-ranking black officers.
Well, one of the strengths and one of the most important things, it seems to me, is that the 369th has an integrated officer corps from its inception. And what one is struck by is this notion of providing an opportunity for African Americans to become officers, to become line officers with real duties, with real authority, is something that really begins with the 369th.
When the United States entered World War I, the 15th Regiment was mobilized. Colonel Hayward was convinced that his regiment would distinguish itself. He wrote,
"Given the proper training, these men will be the equal of any soldiers in the world."
The regiment never got proper training because the War Department decided to send most of this black regiment to train alongside white New York National Guardsmen here at Camp Wadsworth in Spartanburg, South Carolina. Spartanburg's mayor set the welcoming tone by saying, "They will probably expect to be treated like white men. I can say right now that they will not be treated as anything except Negroes." Black soldiers were pushed off sidewalks, denied service in shops, insulted. Captain Napoleon Bonaparte Marshall, a Harvard graduate and New York attorney, was called a dirty nigger and thrown off a streetcar. A rumor about a lynching sent armed soldiers into town one night. Hayward raced to town, found the rumor was untrue, and marched the men back to camp. A few days later, Sergeant Noble Sissel, the band's drum major, was attacked by the owner of a hotel when he went into the lobby to buy a newspaper. White New York National Guardsmen surrounded and menaced the hotel owner. A large group of black soldiers started toward the hotel. The commanding voice of James Reese Europe stopped everyone cold in their tracks, and he marched all the soldiers, white and black, out of the hotel. Concerned with the conditions his men were enduring, Colonel Hayward went to Washington and met with the Secretary of the Army.
And the Secretary came up with several possible solutions in moving the unit to another training base or bullying the town into cooperation or whatever it was. And apparently my grandfather came up with a third option, which was send them to France, which they actually did. So that's how they came to be one of the very early outfits in Europe, and principally to get them out of the Spartanburg, South Carolina.
The regiment was not yet trained for combat, but it is unlikely the War Department had any intention that they or any other black soldiers would ever see combat in World War I. Proof of that was the decision not to send the 4 well-trained and experienced regular Army black regiments to France.
When the war breaks out, the United States government decides that it really would prefer that this is a war fought by white Americans. And so its first major decision is that the standard black units, the traditional units, the 9th and 10th Cavalry, the 24th and 25th Infantry, will not play a role in World War I. They are sent to Hawaii, they are sent to California. They are basically kept out of the war.
When they embarked for France, the men of the 15th Regiment had no way of knowing that the War Department planned to exclude black soldiers from combat. A more immediate problem was crossing the Atlantic.
They got a ship, I think, called the Pocahontas. They loaded them on board, and I think it went out of Bayonne, New Jersey. And the ship started out, and it broke down. They had to be towed back into port. They got the ship repaired. Soldiers got back on, and then they started out again. And the ship ran into another ship in the harbor, and they had to turn around and come back in again. And Colonel Hayward is said to report to the port commander, who was General Schenck at the time, that he had run into a ship and they were back in the harbor. And this is around Thanksgiving, and the general says, "Goodness gracious, Colonel, you ever going to get those coons and turkeys to France?" Well, they had turkeys on board, which was to deliver Thanksgiving, but the coons, what he referred to, were the soldiers of the 369th.
The men of the regiment spent Thanksgiving in the United States.
At any rate, some time passed, and they finally got the ship repaired again, and they all got on board, and they started out, and then they ran into another ship in the outer harbor, but it didn't do too much damage because they were able to repair it while they were on their way.
At the end of the voyage, 2 wars awaited the regiment, one against the Germans, the other against racism. Harlem's 15th Regiment arrived in Brest, France, shortly after Christmas 1917, and they boarded boxcars for the ride to a big U.S. Army base.
On the way going to St. Nazaire, they had it was a policy when the regiments passed through the different little places, wherever the Red Cross was, they used to open the windows and serve coffee. But when we would go through a place, they would open the windows. As soon as they see it was a black regiment, they would close the windows. That I know, that I seen with my own eyes.
Facilities at the base were rigidly segregated.
When we got our billets where we were living, and boys started going to the toilets and different things, the first place we went in was all set up white, black, fountains white, toilets white, black. About 2 hours of that, a big fight started. The next day, we assembled, and they issued out picks and shovels. And we, after that, every morning, we would assemble and march down to St. Nazaire and do work, fixing tires and whatnot all through the time. This we done from January until about the end of March.
The band was exempted from labor details. It was dispatched on a concert tour that made musical history. One of the best military bands ever assembled, it performed across France, giving thousands of French soldiers and civilians their first taste of jazz. From the moment the band marched off the Pocahontas, playing a syncopated Marseillaise, it was a hit with the French allies, and even with their barnyard animals. Meanwhile, back in Saint Nazaire, the rest of the regiment rankled under its manual labor assignment. Colonel Hayward lobbied the U.S. command, the American Expeditionary Force, for a combat assignment. He finally got one from the commander of the AEF, General John J. Pershing. Pershing was an old cavalry officer and had served with and respected the Buffalo Soldiers of the 9th Cavalry. When he was assigned to West Point later in his career, he frequently and unfavorably compared the cadets to the black cavalrymen. They retaliated by nicknaming him Black Jack, both for his preference for black soldiers and for his nasty manner. The nickname stuck. The French army, on the verge of collapse after 4 years of war, asked Pershing for reinforcements. He assigned the 3,000 men of the 15th Regiment to the French Fourth Army. The African-American soldiers were finally getting a chance to fight. They would be the first black Americans to see combat in World War I, but they would do their fighting in a foreign army because their own had no combat role for them.
We was assembled and was told that we would now be fighting under the French Fourth Army. Then they issued us French equipment, gas masks, rifles, and whatnot. The rifles that they gave us was the rifles that they claimed was used in 1870. They were clips of 3 bullets, that's all. We even had French food, and we had French eating time. We had red wine, which I never drank. At 10 o'clock, we had always an issue of red wine. But from then on, we fought under the French, not the Americans. We had never seen no Americans. Every section of front we went on was formerly a French front. The first one was a Noose Argonne. I remember that.
And they were, I believe they were assigned, each soldier was assigned a French soldier that they worked with, they paired up with. And the French had no prejudice about black men being fighting men.
The fact that the 15th had not completed its American combat training was probably a plus. They had fewer American tactics to unlearn, as they were taught French tactics. Veterans of Sandlot and high school baseball, the men were better at throwing grenades than their French instructors.
We were trained to throw them in one way. We threw them the way we'd throw a baseball. We didn't go through this 1, 2, 3 stuff. Go, grab it and throw it just like you throw a baseball. I could see it bust. Yeah, when it was real close.
Ironically, the regiment which had been serving under the New York state flag now got its federal designation, the 369th U.S. Infantry, while serving with the French Army. The American Army, having sent a black regiment to fight in a foreign army, now added insult to injury. A Colonel Leonard in AEF headquarters sent a secret memo to the French urging them not to spoil the American blacks by treating them as equals.
The United States military establishment went to great extremes to try to convince its allies, especially the French, that blacks should not be used as soldiers, or at the very least should be treated in a certain way so that they would, quote, still be suitable, unquote, for their return.
The Leonard memo had no effect on the French.
The French received us very good, the French soldiers and also the French people. They was fine people, and they wasn't prejudiced. In fact, they would take up for them in fights with the whites. And pretty near all the whites that we met was Southern soldiers. That's when the shock came. And from then on, I experienced segregation in its greatest form. In them days, it was pretty outright, straight outright.
When the Leonard memo came to light, the French Chamber of Deputies passed a resolution affirming the absolute equality of man. By that time, the 369th had delivered its own lesson in the equality of man by performing heroically on the battlefield. James Reese Europe became the first black American officer to go into combat in World War I by accompanying French soldiers on a nighttime raid of German trenches. The rest of the regiment responded bravely to its introduction to combat. Colonel Hayward wrote of his regiment's first exposure to an artillery barrage.
The boys just laughed and cuddled into their shelter and read old newspapers. They are positively the most stoical and mysterious men I've ever known. Nothing surprises them. Captain Clark called for 12 volunteers for a raid, and the company fell in to the last man. All wanted to go, and he had to pick his 12 after all. Do you wonder that I love them? Every one, good, bad, and indifferent?
The colonel also thought he had a mystery for the Germans. He wrote,
None of my men have been captured so far, and the boys wear a French blue uniform when they go on raids. I've been thinking if they capture one of my Puerto Ricans in the uniform of a Normandy French regiment, and this black man tells them in Spanish that he's an American soldier in a New York National Guard regiment, it's going to give the German intelligence department a headache trying to figure it out.
in fact, the Germans knew there were black Americans in the Allied trenches, and they wanted to capture one.
Well, the story is that Henry Johnson, Needham Roberts on this outpost, way out in the front of the other soldiers on line. Needham Roberts was on the post looking out when the Germans came up. And they shot him. And they grabbed him and they was getting ready to hustle him away when Henry Johnson heard the commotion, and with his rifle, he started firing into the German platoon, killing as many, reloading as many clip as fast as he could, and firing. And when he ran out of ammunition, he pulled out his bolo knife and jumped into the crowd.
In a letter to Johnson's wife, Colonel Hayward described the rescue.
Fighting desperately, he opened with his bolo the head of the German who was throttling Roberts. Roberts, released from the grasp of the scoundrels, began again to throw hand grenades, and the Germans picked up their dead and wounded and slunk away. So it was in this way the Germans found the black Americans.
So I saw them when they brought them back. Neither one of them could walk. They had Needham. Needham was carried back in the front of Roberts, and Roberts was in the back. They had two guys carrying Johnson. And Johnson his legs was gone, his legs was hanging, and the blood was all on the bolo knife they had. They had the bolo knife that he was split the German head with. That was soaked with, just caked with blood. And he passed through, he had to pass through our line to come back to get out. That's when I saw him and John.
Johnson and Roberts were the first American soldiers, black or white, to receive the French Croix de Guerre. Incredibly, they received no U.S. decoration for valor.
We're fighting still for Henry Johnson to get one of the highest medals that the United States can offer him. The medal that he got was the medal from France, not from us. It's an honor. You fight and you work so hard for the country that you live in. It would be nice for you to be recognized by that country.
The 369th continued to fight for their country and for recognition. All told, 171 of the Harlem Hellfighters won individual Croix de Guerre from the French Army for exceptional bravery. In one daring exploit, a lone sergeant, William Butler, rescued 5 of his comrades from a German patrol, single-handedly killing at least 5 enemy. A German report on the incident claimed the Americans had attacked, quote, in overwhelming numbers. The overwhelming number was 1. No wonder the Germans nicknamed them Hellfighters. But their bravery counted for little with their fellow white Americans.
Any time that we were involved with Americans, no matter where it was at, we was always ostracized. Always. Always pointed out or mistreated. All I know, I was disappointed and very bitter at the time.
Aware of the discrimination the Hellfighters faced, the Germans bombarded the African Americans with propaganda.
First of all, the Germans recognize that there was something ironic about a people fighting for democracy who technically didn't have it at home.
They always dropped the pamphlets over the outfit that where they think the Negroes was, told us not to fight because we wasn't going to get nothing for it. And they were right. That day they were right, but we didn't know nothing about that. We didn't know what's going to happen when we get back home.
And the idea of fighting in the war was to be a part of the United States, to be a party to their wars, to take the responsibility as citizens, which was sometimes denied, even to the point that they didn't want them as an American unit. They felt by fighting for the United States, even though it was under the French flag, they would gain that recognition. And that's the sort of reason they would never go over to the enemy side.
They just figured that the Germans didn't want us to fight because we were whipping them. That's all. They didn't want us to fight because we were whipping them. They didn't want to fight with the colored boys. Because they said the colored boys were the best soldiers, the best fighters in the army.
The Hellfighter fighting spirit was proven in the last great German offensive of the war, a massive thrust which began on July 15, 1918.
They gathered us up quickly, and we were still with the French at that time, and shipped us down to the place where the Germans was, they claimed, 18 miles from Paris. That's where the French stopped them the last time.
The French had set a trap, pulling back the bulk of their forces and leaving a thin line of defenders, including the Harlem Hellfighters. Assessing the situation, Colonel Hayward wrote,
"The first thing I knew, all there was between the German army and Paris, on a stretch of front a little more than 4 miles long, was my regiment of Negroes. But it was fair enough at that. All there was between us and Berlin was the German army. They tried pretty hard to get by, but they never did. No German ever got into a trench with my regiment who did not stay there, or go back with the brand of my boys on them."
When the Germans approached, the Harlem Hellfighters held their line. French artillery pulverized the German army. Gas devices left in bunkers killed thousands of Germans who took refuge from the artillery. The German offensive stalled. In spite of the regiment's successes, the American Expeditionary Force decreed that black units must have either an all-black or an all-white officer corps. Colonel Hayward's black officers were replaced by whites. Only James Reese Europe won a dispensation so he could continue to lead his band. Still, Colonel Hayward was positive.
"I feel it has been a tremendously important experiment when one considers the hosts of colored men who must come after us. I wish I had a brigade, yes, a division or a corps of them. We'd make history and plant the hobnailed boots of the heavy Ethiopian foot in the Kaiser's face, all right."
There wasn't a corps of black infantry, but there was supposed to be a division. By this time, the other regiments that were to comprise the all-black 93rd Division arrived in France. The AEF assigned all of them to the French army as well. But now they were equipped with American helmets and rifles. In the autumn, the Allies mounted their final offensive of the war. This would be the roughest combat the Hellfighters and the other African-American troops would ever see.
So I have to say this much. I pray, and I guess my mother pray, and I didn't get hit. But so many guys got hit with me, fall. And we couldn't stop to pick them up or do nothing with them. We had to keep on going.
They kept on going through heavily fortified German positions, inflicting and suffering heavy casualties. All told in the war, 200 Harlem Hellfighters were killed and another 800 were wounded, about 1/3 of the regiment. More of the casualties occurred during this offensive than at any other time. One of the most vicious weapons in World War I was poison gas. Both James Jones and Herbert Young were victims.
During that time, the second day on the last drive, I was knocked out then by a gas shell. I believe, a gas shell. Anyway, when I woke up, I was in the French hospital with a big sign on me, gas, right leg bleeding. That was all in French. But the tag that said gas was in big white letters, gassed. And underneath that was right leg bleeding at knee.
I told him I didn't want to go to the hospital because once you go to the hospital, you don't catch your outfit no more. And I didn't want to leave my outfit. I came over there and I wanted to come back with them.
In that final offensive, the Harlem Hellfighters moved further and faster than anyone thought possible. For its heroism in this action, the unit was awarded a regimental croix de guerre by the grateful French. The Allied offensive had broken the German army. The armistice was signed on November 11, 1918 at 11 a.m. The Hellfighters had won all their battles against the Germans. Their fight against discrimination would continue. In the French army, officers of Hayward's rank were not expected personally to lead their troops in an assault. So, during one battle, Colonel Hayward tore the eagles off his shoulders and led his men. A French general ordered him to retire. He replied,
"My men never retire. They go forward or they die."
They were brave, even theatrical words, but they were also true. Despite the fact that it had less training before going into combat than any other American unit, the 369th had a distinguished record. In his official report on the first black American unit to see combat in the Great War, Colonel Hayward proudly wrote,
"It is my desire to record the fact that the regiment was under fire for 191 days, all told, and during all this time never lost a prisoner, a trench, or a foot of ground."
Their entire war was fought under French command. They never served in an American brigade or division. Their 191 days at the front were the longest service by at least 5 days of any American unit, black or white.
That I know without anybody telling me. Because I know when we hit the line, we ain't never seen nothing else but back and forth. If one group was on there, 10, 11 days, they went back, another group took their place. We're still on the lines, and the only time we got off the line was to go back for delousing.
Even after the armistice, the 369th continued to rack up firsts. It was the first Allied unit to cross the Rhine into Germany. There it established a military government and occupied 3 German towns. The bond between Colonel Hayward and his men would last decades.
Even after the war, when he was had his office on 42nd Street, any of the boys that got in trouble used to go to him. Any of the working boys that got in trouble on the jobs would go to him, and he would go to the front for them. Yeah. Nobody ever had any kick for Colonel Hayward. They all loved him.
Colonel Hayward and his officers were exceptions to the rule, as James Jones learned in a U.S. Army hospital. Although he was a wounded combat veteran, Jones was pushed to the end of the food line at every meal. He complained to the hospital's commanding officer, who responded,
"And where I come from," he said, "you and your people was always last." That's what he did. And that's why he looked at me like that. So I said, "Well," I said, "ain't nothing I can do." He said, "No, it ain't nothing you can do." He said, "But however you get your meal." I said, "Yeah, I get my meal." And that was all. So I left there.
On February 12, 1919, the Hellfighters returned to the United States aboard the ocean liner Stockholm. As they steamed into New York's harbor, James Reese Europe, unaware of an ironic twist of fate awaiting him, led the band that had made musical history in a concert for the men who had made military history. They had made all that history in a mere 14 months. The return of the Harlem Hellfighters to New York was a triumph. They joined other returning units to march up Fifth Avenue from Greenwich Village to Harlem, marching in a French formation led by James Reese Europe and the incomparable band, enjoying the cheers of all New Yorkers. The Harlem Hellfighters appeared to have accomplished their mission.
Many people felt that that was a moment when New Yorkers celebrated the achievement of New Yorkers, not black New Yorkers, not white New Yorkers. But when the 369th got to Harlem, Harlem exploded. Because in a way, for the citizens of Harlem, this was the unit that had done all that it promised. It had fought and fought successfully. It had done it with pride. It had battled against discrimination. And what it had done was it had proven to all Americans that blacks deserve equality by the fact that they fought and died on the battlefields of France.
Even the Hellfighter wounded got in the parade. They were driven through the streets and cheered wildly. But when the cheering ended, reality set in.
The real war came after they came home. The reason I say that is because the families of veterans suffered very much. So when they came home, there was no jobs and no housing.
But when we got back home, I couldn't even buy a job, no matter what I was doing. I couldn't even buy a job to shine shoes. And I was a good mechanic.
Even for Henry Johnson, who was treated as a hero among heroes that day, the future was grim. Disabled by his wounds and unable to work, he died in poverty and was buried in an unmarked grave.
I think that all wars should recognize the family and the children and the men that went away and didn't come back. And some of them come back and they were of no use to their family, mentally and physically. Because here I am, 75 years old, telling the story of the men of World War I. So who's going to tell the story of World War II and the Vietnam? Who's going to tell it and be concerned about the people that were in those wars?
Even for the great James Reese Europe, victory proved hollow. He had survived the dangers of war and now triumphantly resumed his musical career at the head of the civilian Harlem Hellfighters band. In Boston one evening, he quarreled with one of the drummers. The drummer attacked Europe with a tiny penknife, cut his throat, and killed him. Almost immediately, white America began ignoring the Harlem Hellfighters' contribution, as James Jones learned from the soldier filling out his discharge.
He said, "What battles was you in?" I started naming Newson, Champagne, and he stopped. He said, wasn't no blacks on the front. He said, wasn't no blacks on the front. I didn't say nothing. I was so anxious to get out of there. I didn't open my mouth. And when he said, he started writing his name on the discharge. He gave me the discharge. I looked on the back of it, and he said on the back there he had none. Come back none.
8 decades later, he is still trying to set his personal war records straight. There was still discrimination, still limited opportunity. But part of the legacy of the Harlem Hellfighters was the beginning of change.
It changed everything with black people, First World War. From then on, everything was changed for the black people. But before that, the black people were nobody.
After World War I, the 369th Regiment remained an active part of the New York National Guard and continued to make history. Benjamin O. Davis, who became the first black man to earn a star as an Army general, was given command of the 369th, and the regiment added another to its long list of firsts. But there was a long, long way to go.
I know that there was enormous segregation in World War II. Whatever they should have learned from the experiment, the 369th in World War I, they seem to have forgotten at the outbreak of World War II.
Still in segregated units, African Americans again served in combat. But in this war, black GIs kept their American helmets and gear and served in the U.S. Army. The Air Corps grudgingly overcame old prejudices and organized black fighter squadrons which repeatedly outflew the vaunted Luftwaffe. As for the 369th, it was an anti-aircraft artillery unit in the war. Activated for duty, one battalion saw combat in the Pacific Theater. Other elements served in Hawaii and on the West Coast. The 369th was mobilized again during the Korean War, but did not leave the United States. It was during the Korean War that the U.S. military was finally integrated by order of President Harry Truman, himself a combat veteran of World War I. Was the integration of the military part of the Harlem Hellfighters' legacy?
I would argue that there's no doubt that Harry Truman drew from his own experiences when he made that momentous decision. And I think that if the 369th had failed, if an integrated officer corps had not been able to provide the kind of leadership that was required, I think it would have made it harder for African Americans to rise to the ranks of officers.
One of those African American officers, General James, was on active duty when the Army was integrated.
The effect on the I think it made a better Army because just to give you some of the background, the designation 369th, 371st, units with a 3 were all black units. Units with a 6 were all black units. So if you were going to send reinforcements in and it had a 6, you wouldn't send them to a white unit, you'd send them to a black unit. But all this talent with good units and whatnot, it didn't serve the Army well, because if you had a good unit and was black, you couldn't reinforce them into a white unit.
The 369th still serves as a transportation regiment in the New York National Guard. Its most recent assignment, service in the Gulf War. Perhaps the Harlem Hellfighters' greatest contribution was its indomitable spirit in the face of almost constant adversity.
Well, in spite of the treatment, it didn't take anything away from me so far as serving the country. That part, I just didn't, it didn't touch that part at all. I was just as anxious to do whatever I could as I was when I first went in there, regardless of the setbacks and the prejudices. It was a lot of prejudice, all right. Even the worst part was while you was in France fighting. That's where the part that really hurt. See?
I never quit, man. I never say whip, never quit. I was a fighter all my life, and I'm going to keep on fighting as long as I can live. I never give up. I figure there's a will, there's a way. Wherever there's a will, there's a way. If you keep trying, it'll come to you.